We're here with John DeBerry. He's here in a gospel meeting with us at the West Fayetteville Church of Christ, and he has agreed to meet with us today and talk about some things in his preaching background, in his preaching career. And so, Brother DeBerry, again, we're thankful to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm having a wonderful time.
I'll tell you, we're thankful for you being here and thankful for the lessons that you've been bringing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And you mentioned the other night in the early part of one of your lessons about remembering some of the early preachers that influenced you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought we might begin there this afternoon. You mentioned Brother Keeble and
Mm-hmm.
Brother Goodpasture,
Mm-hmm.
Brother Baxter.
Right.
I'd love to hear about more of your thoughts and memories of some of those individuals.
Well, you know, when I was growing up, my father, of course, started preaching very early after the Army. He came home from the Army, and by the time that I was 5 or 6 years old, my dad had started preaching. And so we would go all around Mississippi, Arkansas, and various little churches. I remember many churches my dad went to that had an outhouse. They didn't have indoor plumbing, and they had several of them had big pot-belly stoves in the middle of the building there. And but he went to various places and he preached the gospel. And if there was a gospel minister anywhere within 100-mile radius, I would say 50-mile radius in gospel meetings, we would be in those gospel meetings. So I got a chance to hear Brother Baxter, Brother Goodpasture. I got a chance to listen to Brother Bradfield and others when they were preaching. Mm-hmm. But I distinctly remember Brother Keeble. And Brother Keeble had a school in Nashville. I think it was called the Nashville Christian Institute. And he taught young men to preach there in Nashville. So I had been, Steve, I've been asking my dad to preach since I got baptized in the 4th grade. And he said, no, you're too young, and folks will say it's cute, and I'm not going to let you do it yet. Wow. 5th grade, no. 6th grade, no. 7th grade, no. He would tell me no. So I think somewhere around the 7th or 8th grade, we heard Brother Keeble, and this time he brought young men from the Nashville Christian Institute, and they spoke 5 minutes before he did. And then he got up and finished the time out and preached. And man, at the dinner table, I had some ammunition. And I said, now, see what Brother Keeble did? Brother Keeble had those boys preach. Mm-hmm. And so it's time you start letting me preach. And I preached my first sermon in 1967. That's a full, 5 minutes. I tell folk, my dad said, my son's going to preach. Today it was a fellowship meeting. In the afternoon you eat and then you listen to 3 or 4, 5, 6 preachers. Okay. My dad said, my son's going to preach today. He has 5 minutes and he's going to preach. So I remember my sermon was called Only the Strong Survive. Wow. So I stood up from my seat. I started preaching. I preached all the way to the pulpit. I preached my 5 minutes and then I preached all the way back to my seat. So I think I got myself about 6.5 minutes out of it. My dad elbowed me when I sat down. But it was those preachers. I remember Brother John Harris. They used to call him the Walking Bible back up in the country in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. I remember Brother Umstead. I remember Brother Vance from Jackson, Tennessee. A lot of those old black preachers who were men who, they didn't make a lot of money, but they were strong in the gospel, and they stood for what was right, and they gave me the proper example of what a gospel preacher is, and I thank God for them.
That's wonderful. Did you ever get to hear Brother Keeble in a tent meeting?
Yes, I did, and man, that was something. In those days, especially in the late 50s and early and mid and late 60s, to have a black man standing there with a tent full of white people, it was one of the first times, or the only times, if you please, where you saw black people and white people sitting together worshiping the way they did to listen to Brother Keeble. I think that his ability to communicate to everybody and to anybody was one of the things that I think helped the church to strengthen itself, to change itself, to alter, as well as some of the other preachers who preached the truth and stood for what was right. In the schools, we integrated Freed Hardeman. We were one of the first and largest classes from Freed Hardeman in the early 70s. So yes, to hear Brother Keeble preach in a tent meeting, it was truly an event. Wow. And there were people from everywhere when he preached.
That's tremendous. And it sounds like, so many things, a lot of things are in print, and even some of his recordings, and they're just, it's fabulous to hear how he could turn a phrase or a quippy statement or something that could be humorous, but there was such a huge lesson with it. But as you just mentioned, maybe it gets overlooked sometimes. He was a great bridge builder.
Bridge builder, yes.
Right?
Yes, I remember one, he had an illustration, and when he was talking, he would say, you know what? God put our eyes in the front of our head. He put our feet going forward. He said, because that's the way God wants us to go. God don't want us to go backwards. God wants us to go forward. And of course, that illustration basically said a whole lot to the church and open-minded and receptive-hearted individuals that God is telling us to go forward. Don't go backwards. Go forward. Learn to deal with each other. And he would say things that would make you realize that we're a whole lot more similar than we are different. And that we have a whole lot more in common than we have not in common. And so he was one of those bridge builders, I think, that God sent at just the right time. He didn't have the terminal degrees that a lot of guys have today. He was just a plain old mule-back country preacher. But he was the right man at the right time, along with a lot of other men, white men and black men, who were the right men at the right time to change things.
Wow, that's powerful. That's great. And you mentioned your father, obviously huge influence in in you becoming a preacher. Right?
Yes. My dad, John DeBerry Sr., he would say to me a lot of times, I remember when I was leaving to go to school in the first grade, my dad says, okay, now, Nick, you got my name. Now, he called me Nick, but he said, my name is John Jefferson DeBerry Jr. He said, you got my name. Don't mess up my name. He told me that again when I went to high school.
Wow.
And he said, now you got my name. Don't mess up my name. When I went to Freed Hardeman, when he and my mama drove me up, and we carried 2 vehicles, and he drove the pickup truck, me and him drove together in the pickup truck. And when they were leaving, he shook my hand, looked me in the face again, and said, Nick, you got my name. Don't you mess up my name. I appreciate him because he sacrificed for the church. God gave him a good job after being a veteran. The GI Bill gave him a good home. GI Bill let him get education. And so therefore he gave back to the church, because he said, when I was growing up, we could look through the floor and see the chickens under the house. That's how poor we were. He said, I plowed mules. I chopped cotton. And when we moved to Crockett County, my dad made us chop cotton and pick cotton. He said it builds character. He planted 2 acres of okra. Who plants 2 acres of okra? And you got to pick that stuff every day. He said it builds character. So many things that he did that toughened us, that made us appreciate the land, made us appreciate what God had given us. He built a nice home in town, but he rented land on the outside of town, and he worked us. And I baled hay. I drove a John Deere from can to can't. We learned a whole lot of things that we could not have learned in the city, that we had to move to the country to learn. And I thank God so much for those times that I grew up in a country church with my daddy being the preacher.
That's wonderful experiences. He was thinking ahead.
He was thinking ahead. He was thinking ahead.
Helping prepare you.
Yes, he really was.
That's great. That is great. What about, we was talking about some influences as well. some of the Freed Hardeman teachers, your professors?
Well, you know, brother Elkins didn't teach at Freed Hardeman during my tenure, but he was the preacher at the Getwell Church in Memphis, and my dad and Brother Elkins were good friends, and my dad would always show up there for their gospel meetings at Getwell. But when I went to Freed Hardeman, men like Brother W.A. Bradfield, men like Brother Tom Holland, Brother Garland Elkins, men like Brother Woodson, and others who were teaching there at that time were such an example. Brother Norman Hogan were such examples of just old-time gospel preachers. Wow. They were well educated, but over some preaching dudes back in those days. Yeah. And I remember so well listening to them and thinking, when I went to Freed Hardeman in 1970, I thought I knew the Bible. Man, I've been preaching since I was 15. And I thought I knew the Bible. I thought I was smart. And so when they said, we're going to give you a Bible test, I'm thinking, okay, you're going to give me a Bible test? And I've been preaching since I was 15, and now I'm a freshman in college. Bring it on. Man, I tell you what, when I finished that test, I had an humble spirit saying, teach me, because they taught me I didn't know nothing. Wow. What I knew was a bunch of stuff, and I couldn't connect the dots. So I remember telling Brother Holland one day, and I don't know if it was preacher in his work or sermon prep, I said, Brother Holland, I need you to teach me how to study. Because I knew stuff, but I wasn't connecting it. And Brother Hogan and Brother Bradfield and Brother Holland and Brother Gardner and Brother Woodson and Brother Oldham and all of those good men taught me how to connect the dots to where it's not just knowing a bunch of junk, it's knowing the story and how to tell it to other people. And that's what I appreciate so much about Freed Hardeman.
Wow. That's a great testimony. And we mentioned, we talked before we had this session too about Brother Warren, Thomas Warren. You had him. And
you know, when you look at these men, they were scholars. Yeah. And you read their writings and you think about the enormity of what they produced in a lifetime. Yours and my library is filled with their work and their writings. And I appreciate them so much for being scholars who passed that knowledge on to the next generation. And that's when you think about Brother Thomas Warren and how many times I've gone to his writings to understand the exegesis of a passage and getting deep into it the way he does, and Brother Woods and others. You just appreciate the fact that they were able to send that knowledge on to another generation.
That's right. So thankful for the printed page.
Oh, we? Lord, yes.
And what an influence that has had in the proclamation of the gospel.
That's true. That is so
true.
All down
through time.
That is so true.
What advice would you give to young preachers today?
The advice I would give them, and both of us as preachers who've been on the battlefield for a long time, and I know because I looked a moment at some of your pictures as a young man and how much hair you had, and I told you should have seen my afro that I preached with. My dad at a certain point said, "Okay, boy, it's time to cut that thing."
Is that face reality, right?
Yeah, it's time to cut that thing. But I would give them the advice that I believe that older men gave to the both of us, and that's be real, be God's man, be God's man. Preaching is a vocation. If we're fortunate enough to find a congregation like this one that can take care of your family, that can take care of you in the secular things and the material things so that you can concentrate on the spiritual things, that within itself is a blessing. Sure but is. Either way it goes, even if you have to sacrifice and make tents the way Paul did, you still got to preach the gospel. If you're God's man, you'll find a way to do God's will. And that's what I recommend to them. Be the type of man that no matter what, I'm going to preach the gospel. And I also tell them, when my bride, who I lost about 5 or 6 years ago, in 2015, I guess about 6 years ago, I lost her, but when she stood beside me in 1972, and I remember seeing her walk down that aisle and thinking, Lord have mercy, she actually said yes to marrying me, and she was one of the prettiest girls on campus. When I stood before Brother Yeldale at that time, and he asked me if I would love, cherish, and support her in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, I tell them, she married me. She didn't marry the church. She didn't marry the elders. She didn't marry the city. She married me. Cool. And that it is my responsibility to take care of her. The time came that the little church where I was preaching was doing the best they could. But it wouldn't feed my wife and take care of my children. And I did what I had to do because she's looking to me. You make sure as a young preacher that that woman that you made a vow to before God, that you do what you have to do to see to it that she's looking at you as a man that's going to support her and take care of her and give her the security she deserves as your wife and the mother of your children. And sometimes it's hard. You know that. Sure, we know that. Exactly. But who they depending on? They're depending on you to figure it out. That's right. And that's what we've got to do from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Excellent advice. Excellent. Well, what's needed most in the church today? And again, this is subjective.
I understand.
All of us have things that's on our mind, but I appreciate hearing your perspective.
I think that what's needed most, let's go back to our mission. Let's go back to our mission. There is a mission, there's a message, and there's a methodology that the Lord has given us. Mm-hmm. God didn't send us to blend in, fit in, go along to get along. Mm-hmm. Don't rock the boat, don't shake the tree. Say yes, boss, and go on with whatever the world is telling us to do. Mm-hmm. That's not what he sent us to do. No. Lord sent us to change the world, be change agents, to shine the light, to spread the salt, to shake the boat, to shake the tree, to shake men up. Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. And if you love father and mother more than me, I came to put a variance between the two of you. That's what I came to do, to make you decide whose side you on. I think the church has got to decide again whose side we on. Mm-hmm. If we're on the Lord's side, then it's time for us to stand up for him, lift up the cross, speak his word loud and long so everybody knows who we are, whose we are, and what we stand for. I'm not saying that everybody's got to go into politics, but everybody's got to deal with the politics that the devil brings to us. When the devil tries to change the church, alter our school system, raise our children with materialism, worldliness, secular humanism, and evolution, who should be the first to speak up? God's people. Mm-hmm. God's people. Mm-hmm. Not just retreat. I'm not saying, homeschooling is becoming very popular, and I don't blame you. Sometimes you got to get your children out of that foolishness. But what about the children who need somebody to speak up for them? We need to take the lead in that. And I think the church get back to its mission of preaching the gospel, changing the world, and saving souls. That's what the Lord wants us to do.
Yeah. It's a full-time mission.
It's a full-time mission.
In the distinctiveness of the church category area, how important is consistency in our being distinctive in morality?
I think it's extremely important. We can't, I put it squarely on denominationalism and division, many of the problems that we have today in morality. How are you going to say that Acts 2:38 don't mean what it means? Matthew 16:18 don't mean what it means. Romans 6-8 don't mean what it means. Mm-hmm. Paul's teaching about women in the church don't mean what it means. Paul's teaching on marriage in Ephesians 5 and his teaching on effeminacy don't mean. How are you going to say that if Acts 2:38 don't mean what it mean, Matthew 16:18 don't mean what it mean, then the others don't mean what they mean either. Because what you've done is that you have marginalized the sanctity of the scriptures. You've said that the Bible accounts are mistaken or left up for interpretation. And therefore, if I can make an interpretation on the essentiality of baptism, I can make an interpretation on the essentiality of a man and woman being married. Mm-hmm. If it's wrong in one place, it's wrong in another place. And we have to play squarely on the division we see in the religious world. Because guess what? We see it every day on the mainstream media. They put religion, they put Christianity on trial. Mm-hmm. Whether it is a denominational church or the Lord's church, they put it on trial. They put the Bible on trial. Mm-hmm. And the imperfections of the Bible and the imperfections of Christianity. That means we got to go back to the standard. Mm-hmm. And we got to stand on what is written and not on what is popular.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So many sometimes try to compartmentalize. They have their faith over here, and we feel, okay, as long as we have all the boxes checked doctrinally, mm-hmm. then we could live however we want to mm-hmm. in the world, which is totally inconsistent.
It is not just consistent, but the devil's not blind, and he is also savvy. And when he can point out our hypocrisies, mm-hmm. that, again, undermines our message. If he said, okay, you're not living by that message. You claim you love everybody, and Jesus loved, but you don't love everybody. You're not living a moral life. You're not raising your children in nurture and admonition of the Lord. You're not a good employee. You're the type of person who takes license with your morality and situation ethics. Don't you know the devil is watching that? That's what Paul was talking about in Ephesians 6 when he said the wiles of the devil. That the devil's mm-hmm. trying to figure us out, find our weakness, find our mm-hmm. Achilles heel, and then exploit it. Yeah. That's why Christians have to be steadfast and unmovable. Mm-hmm. We make mistakes like everybody else. Mm-hmm. We're sinners, but we don't practice sin. And we've got to realize that God knows we're going to make mistakes, but he don't want us to wallow in it. He wants us to get it right mm-hmm. and get to walking and following Jesus.
As gospel preachers, we have a lot on our plate, don't we?
We have a lot on our plate.
And it's important to be balanced.
Yes.
And, we have so many issues, in our face today through the media and the culture we're living in our country. But it's important to address those, isn't it, from the pulpit?
The cancel culture of our day wants to beat us down into mediocrity and embarrassment. They want to say, oh, you a bunch of bigots, or you a bunch of right-wing crazies, or you believe that old Bronze Age book, or you're on the wrong side of history, or you're caught in a narrow-minded stupor. They will say, I'm telling you things that have been said about me over the last 30 years in politics and the 50 years of being a gospel preacher. They want to beat us down till we're apologizing for being a Christian. We're apologizing for following the Bible. Mm-hmm. We're apologizing for the way we raise our children. We're apologizing because, as Peter said, that we don't run with them in the same excessive riot. You know what? The Lord gonna get us if we don't stop that foolishness. Mm-hmm. The Lord wants us to uphold the cross. He don't want us to be arrogant and boisterous and proud and blasphemous, but he wants us to let folks know, I'm a child of God. Remember when they looked, I believe, who was it, Peter? I believe it was that the Bible says that they perceived that they had been with Jesus. Mm-hmm. They need to perceive we've been with Jesus. Yes. And that we stand with Jesus. No matter what you do to us, mm-hmm. we're not going to change what we believe and how we live and how we take care of our families.
Mm-hmm. And fulfill 2 Timothy 4:2.
That's
Preach
true.
the word.
Preach the word.
Preach the word.
Preach the word.
Well, this has been awesome getting an opportunity to sit down with you today. Yeah. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And thank you for sharing a lot of those thoughts from your preaching influences that you've had. And all of us have them. it's always valuable to reach back and think about those.
That's true.
And thank you for sharing that. Thanks for being with us, Brother
Thank you
DeBerry.
for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.